Good morning, everyone. It is good to see you. We begin our service today with some words from Teresa Ninan Soto. She writes, or they write, we hold on. There's a moment before dawn when the night is firmly in charge of the sky. There is no arguing with the opacity that holds both a fertile imagination and a cover of destruction. Just hold on. There's a moment when the dream we share is newly born, wet and wriggling in our hands. Sometimes it's true that salvific futures look vulnerable and small before us. We remain unsure. Just hold on. Anything good was small at first. You know that Dr. King said, "I have a dream." It definitely was not the "I have a reality" speech. It was real in a different way that could be felt, that could be shared. They held on. That dreaming speech happened in August 1963. And you know what came before was April, a letter from a Birmingham jail. One moment did inform the other, but the future being built could not be known with certitude. They held on. We gather, Unitarian Universalists, certain only of our power to be human, finding ourselves committed to keeping our word and being our covenant. And when we fail to keep our promises, we don't throw them away, labeled as impossible. We take up our courage. We begin again. We hold on. Sprinkled in the wind, we can hear the question, if we are not white supremacy shaped into religious robes and rituals, then who are we? We are present, both in attention and in the answer. We are here. We hold on. We contain multitudes, not just of questions and contradictions, but also of possibilities. We continue to labor for the creation of community in which all of us, not just each, but every part of us, is welcome in our home of faith. We hold on. Come, let us gather. Come, let us worship together.
Good morning. I'm Bob Davis, a member of the Sunday Services Committee. At People's Church, we welcome everyone, no matter your race, previous religious history, gender identification, or who you love. We especially welcome you if you are visiting us for the first time. We only ask that you join us with an open mind and open heart. Together, we have more strength and more skills than each of us has alone. And multiple churches working together have a larger impact than one church alone. This is one reason People's Church is a member congregation of the Unitarian Universalist Association, or UUA. It is one reason People's Church is a member congregation of Isaac, the local interfaith organization of congregations and strategic partners that are working together to build a more just community. Today, we are remembering the life of a complex gay Black man who recognized the power of organized people in driving the civil rights movement, Bayard Rustin. The mission of People's Church is to be a beloved community, embracing and serving our diverse world. Here, we seek truths in the teachings of all major religions, science, philosophy, and the arts. Here, we recognize that examining and continually re-examining our lives and assumptions and listening to each other's perspectives are as important as the answers we find and profess. We hope you will join us in working to improve ourselves and our community. Today for our chalice lighting reading, we have the following from the Multicultural World of the UUA Leadership Council. With humility and courage born of our history, we are called as Unitarian Universalists to build the beloved community where all souls are welcome as blessings, and the human family lives whole and reconciled. With this vision in our hearts and minds, we light our chalice. So I light my chalice, please, if you are willing and able, enter into the chat box where you are lighting your own.
It is always a joy to see where chalices are lit every Sunday. I have two small stories for us this morning. So our service today is focused on the life of a man named Bayard Rustin, and these are two stories from his childhood. He was born in 1912 and was raised in Westchester, Pennsylvania, which for the time was a reasonably integrated community with a strong Quaker tradition, so committed to the inner light of every person. And when Bayard was in 5th grade, he was out with a group of his white friends, and they came upon one of the few Asian people who lived in their community, a Chinese man who owned a laundry. And they started taunting him using racial slurs that I will not say. And he was really upset, as one would be. And word got around. And word got around to Bayard's mother, Julia. And she was not happy to hear about this racial bullying that her child was engaging in. And so she talked to him about it and talked about how it was against their faith and their teachings and their way of life. And also she made him work for 2 weeks. Every day after school, he had to go and work at the laundry and support this man that he had been cruel to with his time and his labor. And that was a formative experience for him and helped him understand that we all are fundamentally one and connected to one another. And that story informs the next story. So as Bayard grew, he became an excellent football player. And he was known for being a fierce tackler who would recite poetry to his opponents as he was knocking them down onto the field. And his team was good too. And so they started traveling farther and farther for their games, especially as they made the postseason. And this was an integrated high school with an integrated football team. But the coach expected them to stay in segregated lodging, where the white players would get much better accommodations than the Black players. And so Bayard organized his teammates, and especially his Black teammates, and said, we will not play if we are made to stay overnight in a hotel that is different than where our other teammates are staying. And the coach listened, and other accommodations were found, and the team was able to play. And that was one of his first organizing efforts, realizing that just him sitting out would not be enough. But if all of the Black players on the team refused to play, the coach would be more committed to winning than to segregation. And that is what happened. And that was the beginning of his life as an organizer, which I will tell you more about later in the service. People's people are generous people who have responded to this impossible time in creative ways. So about every month, I gather with other ministers serving mid-size UU congregations in the Midwest on Zoom, and we talk about what we're dealing with and how the struggles and seek wisdom from one another. And it's been very helpful for me, but we met this week and I left feeling smug because they were talking about how we were talking a lot about our RE programs and how we've tried to make them work and how it's been challenging in this time, which it has been for us too. But I also talked about the creativity of Diane Melvin and our RE leaders and the generosity of our whole church to purchase all kinds of things to make our outdoor space usable, whether that's from pocket microphones to giant sails to chairs that we can just leave outside all the time and not have to tote in and out and in and out and in and out. Because we have run an RE program outside in Michigan through December. They're inside now more as vaccinations have become available for our younger kids. But it is no small thing to have adapted and had the funds to get the things we need to do that. So thanks to all of you for your generosity, to our RE leaders for their leadership, and for everybody trying to make things work and adjust and readjust and find all of these new ways for us to be a church when we can't be a church the way we used to be. So thank you, and I invite you to continue to be the generous people that you are. The offering will now be received.
If you see something that's wrong, raise your hand and say that's wrong. Point it out and name that thing by its name. Don't stand by and stare. If it's wrong, it's your affair. Don't be quiet, make a riot, be a pain. Be a pain, shout about it and complain. Ignore the crowd and go against the grain. Don't be polite, raise your voice and do what's right. Be a pain, be a pain, be a pain. When Rosa Parks sat on that bus, she chose to make a fuss. She chose to break the rules and take the blame. Her choice to sit and fight helped to bring on civil rights, because one strong woman chose to be a pain. Be a pain, shout about it and complain. If they say you have to move, say I'll remain. Don't be polite, raise your voice and do what's right. Be a pain, be a pain, be a pain. Harvey Milk, he chose to run for the council board and won, even though folks said you can't because you're gay. One brave LGBTQ elected leader ran and knew you can change things if you choose to be a pain. Be a pain, shout about it and complain. Tell them I won't let you make me feel ashamed. Don't be polite, raise your voice and do what's right. Be a pain, be a pain, be a pain. Tennis star named Billie Jean told the world she had a dream that men and women would be paid the same. She refused to hit that ball till there was equal pay for all. She was a king because she was a royal pain. Be a pain, shout about it and complain. If they refuse to pay, refuse to play the game. Don't be polite, raise your voice and do what's right. Be a pain, be a pain, be a pain. Kids from Parkland led the fight for something they all knew was right. They said it's time for us to finally make a change. If adults can't compromise, we must go march for our lives. They spoke out and led the charge. They all were pains. same. Don't be polite, raise your voice and do what's right. Be a pain, be a pain, be a pain. Oh, be a pain, be a pain. Shout about it and complain. Ignore the crowd and go against the grain. Don't be polite, raise your voice and do what's right. Be a pain, be a pain, be a pain.
Please join me in reciting our words of giving thanks. From the countless gifts we each have been given, gifts of life and love and sustenance, we bring these small portions to share in the works of love which none of us can accomplish alone.
People's Church is a community that supports one another in good times and hard times and all the times. One of the ways we do that is by taking time during our worship gathering to invite those who wish to lift up their joys and sorrows and milestones so others may know about what is unfolding. So if you are on Zoom, I invite you to type into the chat box if you feel so moved. If you are in person, I invite you to fill out a card near the front of the sanctuary. And you are also invited to just write or type stone if you just want to be held by our community without going into the details of what is unfolding in your life right now. I will pause our recording so we don't share this on YouTube later, and I invite you to share. I invite you to find a comfortable body position if you haven't. I know sometimes we sit for a little while and get out of whack. And join me in a spirit of prayer. This is a prayer for Martin Luther King Jr. Sunday by Kathleen Rollins. Spirit of justice. God who befriends those who stand upon the constant edges of decision, crucial and alone. We are grateful to be together this morning. We gather especially to remember Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., but not only him, for there were thousands of unnamed women and men who put their bodies and lives on the line so that all may be free. And yet, freedom comes at a cost. And we know that racism and homophobia, ageism and ableism, sexism and classism, all of these often unacknowledged realities prevent us from fully knowing one another, from creating the beloved community spoken of by prophets and ordinary people alike. May the work of Dr. King continue to eradicate injustice wherever and whenever we encounter it. May we continue to speak out against injustice, to speak even if we are afraid our words will not be heard or welcomed. May the spirit of Dr. King continue to flow through our daily living. May we have courage as we continue to stand up for justice, reconciliation, and truth, despite challenge and controversy. Dr. King went to the mountaintop. He saw the promised land, and he reassured us that we will get there one day. May that be no paradisal dream, but a reality in our own time. May it be so. Amen.
Find a stillness, hold a stillness, let the stillness carry me. Find the silence, hold the silence, let the silence carry me. In the Spirit, by the Spirit, with the Spirit, giving power, I will find true harmony. Seek the essence, hold the essence, let the essence carry me. Let me flower, help me flower, watch me flower, carry me. In the Spirit, by the Spirit, with the Spirit giving power, I will find true harmony.
Our first reading today is words from Bayard Rustin from an interview in 1964. He said, "I do not use the word love very often, though I am, as a Quaker, profoundly impressed with what I think it means. Let me put it this way. To love Mississippi Senator James Eastland is essentially to take from him that which makes love for him impossible, his privileged power. Sometimes people have to give it up or have it taken from them in a situation which they consider to be extremely unpleasant for them before they can be stripped enough to be real. Jesus was not talking to the whole world when he said to a particular young man, 'Your problem is money, and until you give it away, you will find no peace. Take all thou hast, give it to the poor, and find your humanity again.' He was telling him, get rid of the power you have exercised as you have exercised it, because it stands in the way of your being a human being. Therefore, to create a political situation where Mr. Eastland's power is limited is to love him, because you are making it possible for him to see himself as a human being. Now, any Negro or any white, no matter what his condition, who is not prepared to do those things which help to make other people human beings, is himself not a human being. And in this sense, love is the cement which holds the bricks of society together. A mother loves her child when she calls him in and scolds him for stealing. She's saving him. He doesn't like it. He feels he'd rather be anywhere than in the kitchen being scolded by her. But she loves him, and she can't let him stay in that condition. Furthermore, what weapons does a minority group like the Negroes have for winning over other people? Are we going to force 9/10 of the population to accept us? Do we have the economic power to make them accept us? Can we create enough violence to frighten them to death? No, we have to win them.
Our second reading is entitled Brave and Startling Truth by Maya Angelou. We, this people on a small and lonely planet, traveling through casual space, past aloof stars, across the way of indifferent suns, to a destination where all signs tell us it is possible and imperative that we learn a brave and startling truth. And when we come to it, to the day of peacemaking, when we release our fingers from fists of hostility and allow the pure air to cool our palms, when we come to it, when the curtain falls on the minstrel show of hate and faces sooted with scorn are scrubbed clean, when battlefields and Colosseum no longer rake our unique and particular sons and daughters up with the bruised and bloody grass to lie in identical plots in foreign soil. When the rapacious storming of the churches, the screaming racket in the temples have ceased, when the pennants are waving gaily, when the banners of the world tremble stoutly in the good, clean breeze. When we come to it, when we let the rifles fall from our shoulders and children dress their dolls in flags of truce, when landmines of death have been removed and the aged can walk into evenings of peace, when religious ritual is not perfumed by the incense of burning flesh and childhood dreams are not kicked awake by nightmares of abuse, when we come to it, then we will confess that not the pyramids with their stones set in mysterious perfection, nor the gardens of Babylon hanging as eternal beauty in our collective memory, nor the Grand Canyon kindled into delicious color by Western sunsets, nor the Danube flowing its blue soul into Europe, not the sacred peak of Mount Fuji stretching to the rising sun, neither Father Amazon nor Mother Mississippi, who without favor nurtures all creatures in the depths and the shores. These are not the only wonders of the world. When we come to it, we, this people, on this minuscule and kithless globe, who reach daily for the bomb, the blade, and the dagger, yet who petition in the dark for tokens of peace. We, this people, on this remote area of matter, in those whose mouths abide cankerous words which challenge our very existence. Yet, out of those same mouths come songs of such exquisite sweetness that the heart falters in its labor and the body is quieted into awe. We, this people, on this small and drifting planet, whose hands can strike with such abandon that in a twinkling life is sapped from the living, yet those same hands can touch with such healing, irresistible tenderness, that the haughty neck is happy to bow and the proud back is glad to bend out of such chaos, of such contradiction. We learn that we are neither devils nor divines. When we come to it, we, this people, on this wayward floating body, created on this earth, of this earth, have the power to fashion for this earth a climate where man and every woman can live freely without sanctimonious piety, without crippling fear. When we come to it, we must confess that we are the possible, we are the miraculous, the true wonder of this world. That is when, and only when, we come to it.
Justice-seeking people, and we are singing, singing for our lives. We are justice-seeking people, and we are singing, singing for our lives. We are young and old together, and we are singing, singing for our lives. We are young and old together, and we are singing, singing for our lives. We are a land of many colors, and we are singing, singing for our lives. We are a land of many colors, and we are singing, singing for our lives. We are all of us together, and we are singing, singing for our lives. We are all of us together, and we are singing, singing for our lives. We are gentle, loving people, and we are singing, singing for our lives. We are a gentle, loving people, and we are singing, singing for our lives.
It's easy to tell the story of the civil rights movement as though it's the story of one person or a small handful of people. Tomorrow is Martin Luther King Jr. Day, after all, not hundreds of thousands of people who acted in big and small ways to create a more just world day. Maybe it should be renamed. Maybe that would be a truer thing to celebrate. So many people had to act for the success of the civil rights movement to be realized. And we know that no one, not even heroes, can make change alone. We know that leaders cannot lead without people who trust in their leadership. We know that communities form each of us, and much of our individual and collective successes are due to chance and circumstance, mentorship, and opportunity. This is not at all to minimize the work and legacy of Dr. King, who is deserving of celebration, but to help us all remember how interconnected we all are, how all of us need all of us to make it, how a person is never alone if their efforts are successful. So today, I'm telling you the story of Bayard Rustin, one of the heroes of the civil rights movement who doesn't get much attention. Without him, Dr. King would not have become the person we remember, the person we celebrate. Without Rustin, King probably would not have developed his commitment to nonviolence. Without Rustin, the I Have a Dream speech would not have happened in the powerful way it did, as Rustin was the organizer of the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, where that speech happened. And Rustin had coached King on his oratory as he rose to prominence. But let's start at the beginning. As I said earlier, Bayard Rustin was born in 1912 in West Chester, Pennsylvania. His birth mom was 17 when he was born, and his maternal grandparents raised him as their child. He didn't learn until much later that the person he thought of as an older sister was the person who gave birth to him. His parents, especially his mother, shaped his destiny. His mother was a Quaker, deeply committed to peace and to the idea that every person holds an inner light worthy of respect, care, and equality. His father worked as a caterer and was a member of the African Methodist Episcopal Church. His parents believed in equality and acted to make those beliefs real in the world. They founded the local chapter of the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, and frequently hosted prominent Black activists in their home, in part because there were no local hotels that would lodge Black people. Rustin told a story of being awakened in the middle of the night and told to get out of bed so W.E.B. Du Bois, the sociologist and first Black person to graduate from Harvard with a PhD, could sleep in Rustin's bed. Bayard Rustin grew into his parents' commitment to peace and equality. He was also extremely talented, a football player, member of the debate team, a singer who later appeared on Broadway, valedictorian of his high school class. As a young man, he began working with organizations that shared his commitment to peace, equality, and justice. He briefly worked for the Young Communists League in the 1930s, but left when it became clear that that organization did not share his commitment to nonviolence and racial equity. He then worked for the Fellowship of Reconciliation, a pacifist organization committed to a world free from violence, and the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, the first Black labor union. He went on speaking tours and organized in churches and on college campuses. As the Second World War began, he organized in support of conscientious objectors to war. Then, the draft board contacted him. As a lifelong Quaker, Rustin could have easily claimed conscientious objector status and spent the war doing alternative service. But that didn't feel right to him. At that time, conscientious objector status was granted only for religious reasons, and usually only to members of the historic peace churches, like the Quakers. And Rustin believed that people of other faiths should also be able to conscientiously object, and that people who opposed war for moral, but not necessarily religious reasons should not be forced to fight. In his letter to the draft board, he wrote, "Though joyfully following the will of God, I regret that I must break the law of the state. I am prepared for whatever may follow." A prison sentence is what followed, during which time Rustin protested conditions in the prison, including segregation. When he was released, he returned to his work for peace and equality. He was deeply committed throughout his life to the Quaker idea of the inner light within each person and believed fundamentally that we are all one. This led him to protest the internment of Japanese Americans on the West Coast, and he organized what were called journeys of reconciliation, where Black and white men would travel together on buses in the Upper South to test laws against segregation on interstate bus lines and peacefully submit to arrest if it came to that. This model was later repeated years later in the Freedom Rides, organized by John Lewis and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Rustin supported the struggle for Indian independence and immersed himself in Gandhian nonviolence, seeing a new and powerful application of the nonviolence that had been a touchstone of his life. Rustin was frequently arrested for nonviolent protest, and he was put on a chain gang doing hard labor after one of his arrests. And his writing about that brutal experience led chain gangs to be outlawed. He led organizing to desegregate the military. He seemed to be everywhere, organizing everything in ways that I find hard to believe are physically possible. If there was a struggle in those years, he was there. And then in 1955, in Montgomery, Alabama, Rosa Parks, as part of an organized effort among Black activists, refused to give up her seat on a city bus and sparked the Montgomery bus boycott. A 26-year-old pastor, Martin Luther King Jr., became a leader of this movement. There hadn't been a mass boycott like this before, and many feared that it might end in violence. A. Philip Randolph, Rustin's boss at the union, sent him to Montgomery to help manage the situation, share some of his wisdom. And Rustin brought his mix of Christian pacifism and Gandhian nonviolence. And it shifted the course of the boycott and the whole civil rights movement. Before Rustin's arrival in Montgomery, the emerging movement was not committed to nonviolence. King had armed guards outside of his home and had applied for permission to carry a gun himself. Rustin helped King and other leaders come to know that this movement would not be victorious through violence. The path to victory was through moral example, loving the opposition so fiercely that they will have to become more human and change their ways. This path to social change is difficult and requires nonviolence, love, and tremendous discipline. So many of the tactics of the civil rights movement, from nonviolently resisting arrest to focusing on love of enemies, to organizing on churches and college campuses, to the inspiring speeches of Dr. King, owe a debt to Bayard Rustin. In the early years of the civil rights movement, Bayard Rustin did a lot of ghostwriting and coaching on speaking for Dr. King. Rustin also helped found the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and worked as King's assistant for several years. And 8 years after the bus boycott, Bayard Rustin was the lead organizer of the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. 250,000 people went to Washington, D.C. that day. And Rustin made sure that people of all races from across the country knew the event was happening and that they were invited. He also took care of the logistics, making sure there was enough bathrooms and places to park the buses. He recruited off-duty Black police officers from across the East Coast to volunteer to keep the peace. And he did all of this in 8 weeks without all of the instantaneous communication tools that we have come to rely on. And it worked. That organizing effort, that march, showed the power of the civil rights movement and made it a national struggle instead of a regional one, and led directly to the passage of legislation. So why isn't Bayard Rustin in the pantheon of civil rights heroes alongside Dr. King, Rosa Parks, John Lewis, and others? He was kept from the center of attention by others in the movement. As I mentioned earlier, Bayard Rustin had briefly been involved with a communist organization, and there were few things more toxic to one's public image in the 1950s and 1960s than communism. And he was gay. He had had romantic relationships with men throughout his life. And while he wasn't publicly out, he was out to the people he worked with and unashamed about his sexuality. He had been arrested and convicted of consensual sexual activity with men in 1953 because that was a crime. And a conviction pardoned him just a few years ago, or he was pardoned for that conviction just a few years ago. And so the other leaders of the civil rights movement kept this brilliant strategist, thinker, and organizer who was known as an excellent speaker in his young adulthood, largely off to the side, hidden in shadow. He was a ghostwriter, but not a writer. He organized, but didn't get his name on the program. He provided much of the theological and philosophical basis for a movement, and his name is largely forgotten now. Civil rights leaders sidelined him when it was politically useful. By 1960, Bayard Rustin had been working as Dr. Martin Luther King's assistant for 5 years, helping him found organizations and lead movements, writing articles and speeches for him, at least the first drafts. And another civil rights leader didn't like a campaign that King was planning and threatened to spread a rumor that King and Rustin were having a sexual relationship. King stopped the plan because of that threat and fired Rustin and kept more distance between them. King was worried that such a rumor would undermine his moral credibility and everyone's efforts to achieve equality. The story is complicated. There probably wasn't room for an out gay man with ties to communists as a public leader in the civil rights movement. A prominent Bayard Rustin probably would have decreased the effectiveness of the movement. A Southern senator spent time in the days leading up to the March on Washington reading into the congressional record the details of Bayard Rustin's 1953 arrest and conviction. And had anyone outside of the movement known who Rustin was, that might have mattered. It might have mattered a lot. It might have caused a scandal that distracted from the amazing feat of organizing that he accomplished in this march. And yet we yearn for a different world. A world where Rustin's early mentors did not urge him to marry a woman, any woman, for appearance's sake. A world where a charismatic, strategic, effective Black gay man could have said his own words rather than ghostwrite them into articles and speeches for someone else. A world where a youthful exploration of a different worldview would not disqualify someone from leadership forever. A world where visionaries of all identities are welcomed, heard, and followed. We did not have that world in the 1950s and the 1960s. We don't always have it now, but we can try to make it so. While Rustin's career as an organizer might arguably reached its peak with the March on Washington, it did not end there. He continued in his commitment to many struggles for justice, equality, and peace as he understood them. He continued to be deeply involved in the labor movement and worked to build cross-racial coalitions of working people. He was an advisor to the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. He opposed both war and communism in Vietnam. He was a leader of Social Democrats USA. He worked as an international elections monitor. His earlier commitments grew more complicated, and he advocated for U.S. aid to Israel, U.S. military aid for Israel, and became staunchly anti-communist. As the gay liberation movement began, he largely stayed on the sidelines, though in the 1980s, he became more involved in that movement, largely at the urging of his partner, Walter Nagel. He also legally adopted Walter, as that was the best way to ensure rights such as inheritance and being treated as family by the healthcare system and other bureaucracies at a time when civil unions and marriage equality were a distant dream. Bayard Rustin's friendship with Thurgood Marshall, the civil rights lawyer who became a Supreme Court justice, helped inform Marshall's opinion that laws that criminalized consensual sex between adult men are unconstitutional. He was there, it seems like, almost always, whatever the fight was, whatever the effort for peace or equality. So why tell this story now? It's important to tell a history that's as close to accurate as we can make it. There are so many fights right now about what the purpose of history is. Are we supposed to feel good about the past and how far we've come? Maybe sometimes, but history, like life, is always messy and complicated. The story of Bayard Rustin is no exception. He was a powerful leader who didn't get to lead publicly because of his sexual orientation, and other civil rights leaders did not consistently treat him well. And yet we would have had a very different civil rights movement had he not gone to Montgomery in 1955 and shared what he knew. He showed up anyway, and that counts for a lot. So on this weekend, when we remember and celebrate Martin Luther King Jr. and the civil rights movement and commit ourselves to realizing the dreams of that movement that have not yet come to be, we tell Bayard Rustin's story too. And let us, in our own efforts to build a beloved community, embracing and serving our diverse world, create opportunities for visionaries of all identities to be listened to, followed, and celebrated. May it be so. May we make it so. And amen.
Though days be dark with storms and burdens weigh my heart, though troubles wait at every turn, I know I can go on. When sorrow heals my soul and burdens make me strong, though troubles wait at every turn, I know I can go on. And though the journey is long, the destination is near. Though troubles wait at every turn, I know I can go on. So brothers, take my hand, and sisters, sing my song. When home awaits at every turn, I know we will go on.
So, dear ones, as we celebrate Martin Luther King Jr. Day, may we remember all of the people, the hundreds of thousands of people who showed up, who sacrificed, who did the work to make our world a bit more equal. And may we step into that legacy and do the work that is ours to do to make the dream that has not yet come true be true. Let us go in peace and go in love. And this is the moment where I invite those of you who want to stay for 15, those of you on Zoom who want to linger for conversation, to do absolutely nothing and listen to a beautiful postlude and then be split up into small groups. And those of you who are done with your your church today and want to continue on with your Sunday, I invite you to leave this Zoom space with our blessings. It is good to be with you.